the politicians and have created a political system that is totally unresponsive to the needs of the overwhelming majority of the American people. And that is causing a reaction. Now, the reaction has to become conscious of what the The economy is the classic example where, because of usury, the wealth has been concentrated in so few hands that these people can now buy the politicians and have created a political system that is totally unresponsive to the needs of the overwhelming majority of the American people. And that is causing a reaction. Now, the reaction has to become conscious of what the causes are and come up with a program. That hasn't happened yet. And I think the main roadblock in discourse is this taboo about talking about Jews. You can't address the issue. If you're conservative, you're upset about pornography and abortion and gay marriage. And if you're a liberal, you're upset about the wars in the Middle East, and you're upset about the banking system and the looting of the manufacturing base of the United States. Well, there's one group of people that has all these things in common. And if we can't address that group of people, that group's pernicious influence on our culture, we're never going to get anywhere. There has been precedent. The Catholic Church has had a long track record of dealing with a Jewish minority in a Christian culture. And the name of that precedent is called Sicut Judaeus Non. And basically, no one has the right to harm the Jew, but on the other hand, the Jew does not have the right to corrupt your culture. That's a modus vivendi, I think, that needs to be brought back, and we need to have that discussion again. And we need to break through these taboos, because so far we haven't succeeded in making a dent in anything. They can subvert all of these institutions, and we can't even say who is doing the subverting. We can't even address the people who are doing the subverting. It's got to change. You cannot understand history, the history of the West, beginning with the time of Christ to the present day, unless you understand the role of the Jew as the protagonist of anti-logos. When St. John wrote the Gospel in Greek, he had to incorporate Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy became part of the Christian patrimony by the very fact that he wrote in Greek. And so when you say, the first sentence of the St. John's Gospel is, Ein arche, ein ha logos. In the beginning, there was logos. In a sense, that's the great metaphysical statement that we have to understand here. We are all creatures of logos. In a sense, logos created us. And it's up to us to find out our situation with vis-a-vis logos. Greek philosophy was integrated into Christianity by the writing of St. John's Gospel. And the word then, in the bigger picture, is reason. Logos is eternal. There's no logos pre-Christ or post-Christ. It's the same logos. It is eternal. And it takes energy to reject logos. And I'm saying that's the job of Jewish leaders, is to keep these people all together rejecting logos. A contemporary example of this, the Coen brothers film A Serious Man, is a good example about the tyranny of the rabbi over the Jewish people. They understand it intuitively, that the rabbi is the enemy of the Jewish people, because the rabbi is the roadblock between the Jewish mind and logos. The rabbi is the representative of Talmud, which is the hate speech that keeps Jews separated from Logos. In any human context, the people are going to respond to the truth, to reality, and that is Logos. The Jew is in a special circumstance. Every Jew has to face this in one way or another. You have to face the fact of, who am I? Do I fit in with the group that they say I belong to? And a lot of people say no. Israel Shamir is one of them. He was in an artillery fight. He was serving in the Israeli army. He thought, wait a minute, who am I working for here? Gilad Atzmon. I could go down the line, all the way back through history. Jews wake up to Logos. And either they follow Logos to the extent that is possible, and I'm saying, as a Christian, the fullest extent possible would become to accept baptism and accept Jesus Christ as the Logos incarnate. It's the full, but there are all sorts of intermediary stages. And the crucial thing is, am I going to accept Logos and follow it wherever it goes, the truth, or am I going to become part of this operation because of the material benefits that accrue from being part of this operation? That's the fundamental question, I think. You cannot understand history, the history of the West, beginning with the time of Christ to the present day, unless you understand the role of the Jew as the protagonist of anti-Logos. This is exactly what Friedrich Romick said in his book, Der Sinn der Geschichte, the meaning of history. As soon as you say that there is a meaning in history, this is what the meaning has to be. This is the only possible meaning of history. His book is an attack on positivism, which says there is no meaning in history. It says history is meaningless. And no one believes that, ultimately, I think. Everyone believes that there's a meaning to history. But the only candidate that can fulfill this is the conflict, I think, between Jesus Christ and the Jews. The true meaning of history, because it has expanded now from that small beginning to encompass everything on earth. In a sense, there's not a culture on earth that has not been dragged into this conflict. Take China, for example, that had a culture that existed long before the culture of the West. They were dragged into this via Karl Marx. And now via Milton Friedman, who is the successor, the new architect of the economic system in China. 30-some years after the death of Christ, the revolutionary spirit reaches its fruition, and there's an uprising in Palestine, and they rise up against the Roman conquerors. And it ends in disaster for the Jewish people. The Jewish revolutionaries hold out at Masada, at this mountain redoubt, and they commit suicide. That's not the end, though. 60 years after that, another Jewish revolutionary rises up, and this man's name is Simon Bar Kokhba. He is successful in driving the Romans from Palestine for a certain period of time, and then gradually the Romans cut them off from the sea, and they take over one city at a time, and they basically start to starve them to death, so that they're now holed up in Jerusalem. At this point, a Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, recognizes that the Romans are going to win, so he gets himself smuggled out in a shroud. He goes to the Roman general and says, "I'm a friend of Rome, please grant me one wish. I want to start a school." This is the man who starts Judaism. This is modern Judaism, because what happened in 70 was that the temple was destroyed. You cannot have Judaism without a temple, without a priesthood, and without sacrifice. That all was destroyed then, and so you have to reconstitute Judaism, and so it's this new entity that is younger than Christianity. It's not older than Christianity. And that is what gets started. And at that point, the Jewish people are dispersed throughout the Roman Empire and eventually take up their abode in two main places, which are the enemies of Rome, the successor of the Roman Empire. The enemies of Christendom, which would be Turkey in the east and Spain in the west. And then take up positions of power, generally at this point in anti-Christian countries like Turkey and Moorish Spain. Rome was a culture based on usury. It was capitalism before there was capitalism. And capitalism is state-sponsored usury. So usury was enforced in the Roman Empire, and the Jews did not bring it there. The Jews got involved in usury primarily during the Middle Ages as a crucial factor in history. It was the Middle Ages because Christians were forbidden to take usury on loans. And so what you have is a long, complicated process during which the Christians used the Jews. Florence under Cosimo de' Medici. Florence was a proto-capitalist culture where the oligarchs appropriated surplus labor, surplus value from the laborers, which meant that the laborers were not getting paid a decent wage. So what did Cosimo do? He brought the Jews into Florence to lend the worker the money that their employers were not paying them. Something similar to what happened in the United States in the 1970s, when the wages started to go down, the credit card appeared, to give the worker the illusion that he had money, which he did not have. So it was that kind of bondage. And the Jew, at this point, learned predatory Jewish financial behavior, which is usury.
With usura hath no man the house of good stone.
1239, when St. Raymond of Peñaforte introduced Nicholas Donin to Pope Gregory IX. And Gregory IX was stunned. He had never heard, the church had never known that there was a Talmud. But the written Talmud had been in existence for 600 years, the church didn't know about it. And so he said, this is awful that they would have these type of blasphemies in this book, that the Blessed Mother was a whore, that the father of Jesus Christ was a Roman soldier, that Jesus Christ is now buried up to his ears in excrement, burning excrement in hell. This cannot be tolerated in a Christian society.
Rabbi Tovia Singer. I'm the director of an organization called Outreach Judaism. I've devoted my life to helping Jews who've converted to Christianity return back to the Jewish faith. Evangelical Christians are targeting Jews worldwide, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to bring you and those that you love to the church. They claim that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, the belief in the Messiah is uniquely Jewish, and it's a fundamental principle of the Jewish faith. They claim that Jesus somehow fulfilled these prophecies, but really, what does the Jewish scripture say about the Messiah? Why doesn't Judaism accept this Christian claim? It's a fantastic claim, and it lacks evidence. Tanakh tells us, our Hebrew Bible tells us, that there are certain events that will unfold in the Messianic age. When Mashiach comes, there'll be an ingathering of the exiles. That's Ezekiel chapter 37. The knowledge of God will cover the world as the water covers the sea. That's Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9 and verse 10. There'll be a resurrection of the dead. That's Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. The temple, the third and final temple, will be rebuilt. If you look today at the Temple Mount, you'll see there a couple of Islamic shrines, and it's laying in destruction, waiting for the redemption. But Ezekiel chapter 37, all the way through 47, describes the third temple that will be there forevermore. So we have all these messianic prophecies telling us what the Mashiach is supposed to do. And now we ask the question, there have been hundreds of people throughout history, maybe thousands, who've claimed to be the Messiah, Jesus included. What do they all have in common? They didn't fulfill a single one of these prophecies. There was no building of the temple during the first century. In fact, it was destroyed. There was no ingathering of exiles during the first century, the Jews who were exiled. There was no resurrection of the dead. The Jews were murdered by the Romans in the ongoing wars. There was no worldwide knowledge of God during the first century, because as a result of these wars with Rome and the destruction, the havoc of the destruction of the Second Commonwealth, the knowledge of God and the observance of mitzvot were diminished. What's the key? The key is know your own Tanakh, know your own scriptures. If you can look at the great passages of Ezekiel and Isaiah that tell us exactly what will occur. The lamb will lie with the lion. There'll be a worldwide peace when the Messiah comes. Lo yisa goy al goy cherev. Nation will not lift up sword against nation. Isaiah chapter 2. Are we living in a time when there is peace? No. We are living in a great time, however, where we're observing the events that are bringing us to this great redemption happening before our eyes. Know your scriptures, understand your own faith, and no missionary will be able to rob you of a relationship with God. Thanks for joining me.
The written Talmud had been in existence for 600 years. Church didn't know about it. And so he said, this is awful that they would have these type of blasphemies in this book. This cannot be tolerated in a Christian society. So he turned to Raymond of Peñaforte and he said, I want you to put this book on trial. And if it's found guilty, burn it. And I want you to dedicate your order to the conversion of the Jews and the Moors. And what that led then to Thomas Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles, Raimondo Martini's Pugeo Fidei adversus Judeos et Mauros. It was the most successful conversion campaign in the history of the church, I'd have to say, or certainly one of them. They had either converted or they had left and gone to Poland. In a sense, you could say, well, they were forced. There was an element of coercion there. And that's one of the most tragic histories, tragic chapters in the history that I wrote, because what you saw from Jewish financial. The written Talmud had been in existence for 600 years. Church didn't know about it. And so he said, this is awful that they would have these type of blasphemies in this book. This cannot be tolerated in a Christian society. So he turned to Raymond of Peñaforte and he said, I want you to put this book on trial. And if it's found guilty, burn it. And I want you to dedicate your order to the conversion of the Jews and the Moors. And what that led then to Thomas Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles, Raimondo Martini's Pugeo Fidei adversus Judeos et Mauros. It was the most successful conversion campaign in the history of the church, I'd have to say, or certainly one of them. They had either converted or they had left and gone to Poland. In a sense, you could say, well, they were forced. There was an element of coercion there. And that's one of the most tragic histories, tragic chapters in the history that I wrote, because what you saw from a theological point of view, the minute the Catholic Church understood that there was such a thing as a Talmud, they worked for the conversion of the Jews because they understood this is a totally wicked ideology. It is an anti-Christian ideology. To understand the crux of the matter, you have to go back to Alexander VI, which many people consider the worst pope of the history of the papacy. He was a Spaniard. The Renaissance papacy was decadent. It was carnal. It was involved in the accumulation of wealth. And the reform in the church came through the mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And the great Dominican preacher at this time was Savonarola, who showed up in Florence and denounced sodomy and usury, just as Dante had denounced sodomy and usury in Florence 200 years before that. The papacy had to respond, and the papacy, because Savonarola hated the papacy and because he was hoping that the King of France would come in and depose the Pope, Alexander VI turned on Savonarola and basically connived in his death. He was murdered by the citizens of Florence. I think that was the crucial turning point. The church, the papacy, should have joined in with this reform. They should have stopped usury dead in its tracks at this point. Because they did not, the next time the church did not stop being corrupt. And the next time the protest came, it was Luther. And this time, it was not going to be an intra-juris battle, because the aristocracy saw its chance to steal church property and confer on Luther the status of state church in exchange. And that, once that happened, the church's police power was broken, and that began the rise of capitalism, what we call capitalism now, which is basically state-sponsored usury.
With usura sin against nature is thy bread evermore of stale rags.
There was still this corruption in the papacy. There's no question about it. You also had the rise of German nationalism at this time. There were people who felt that gold, remember, gold is money. That's the only source of wealth. Gold is pouring out of Germany into Rome, and they're depleting. You also had a group of people, the minor aristocracy. Ulrich von Hutten was one of the leaders of the Reformation. It's the minor aristocracy that's being frozen out of the picture by people like the Fugger family, the bankers. The aristocracy is bound up with land, and you've got all these guys who are paying you in bushels of grain, and you need money. And you're frozen out of the money operation, and the leadership is being taken over by these banking families in Augsburg, like the Fuggers. And so you've been disenfranchised. And that becomes a disenfranchised aristocracy is probably the best revolutionary cadre you can have. And that's precisely what Ulrich von Hutten was. So you add that to Luther's situation, which is exactly the situation with the Hussites, of monks who were carnal. Zalewski in Defenestration of Prague, a monk like Luther, a monk like Thomas Müntzer. These were people who hated the evangelical councils. They didn't want to live that way anymore. They were sick of celibacy, sick of fasting, all this type of stuff. The classical world knew about usury, and all of the leaders, the intellectual leaders of the classical world, whether the Hebrew writers or the Greeks, knew that it was toxic and you had to prohibit it.
The most hated, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. And this term interest, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money, because the offspring resembles the parent. Wherefore, of all modes of getting wealth, this is the most unnatural. Aristotle, 350 BC.
But the empires all practiced usury, and the Roman Empire was the classic instance of a usurious empire. Usury then concentrated wealth into fewer and fewer hands. It reduced workers to slaves that would work on huge agricultural operations called latifundia, and it indirectly brought about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Christianity arose to fill the gap left by the collapse of the Roman Empire. And oftentimes they simply took over whatever was left of the mechanism of the Roman Empire. And so diocese is a word that's a Roman designation of an administrative unit, and it's obviously a Catholic designation of a unit. But the difference was that Christianity understood the value of labor in a way that no usury empire can, because there are fundamentally two choices. Either you think that money can copulate, then that's all you need. because you can just put 2 coins together and they will copulate and you'll end up with 3 coins. If you don't believe that, then you have to accept the premise that labor is the source of value. And this is precisely what the church did. The people who saved civilization were the Benedictines largely, the Benedictine monasteries, and their motto was ora et labora. And for the first time in human history, you had a culture that honored labor. And so for 1,000 years, you had a labor-based economy where the monastery would store up the values that were required by labor and concentrate them and put them to social use. This was unprecedented. It's in a sense, a unique period of history because it was the period of history where the Catholic Church had hegemony over the culture, total hegemony. This was also a period during which economic exchange almost went out, almost ceased. And in some areas, there was basically not a monetary economy. So in places like Venice, it still was a monetary economy, never stopped being that. But in the interior of places like the whole...
Oops. Yep, there we go. We're on the air.
Yeah, I think that in order to discuss it fully and accurately, we have to bring the word logos into the discussion. Logos is the Greek word for speech, for rationality, for the order of the universe. It takes up 5 pages in a Greek English dictionary to give you all of the equivalents in English that we use when we talk about the word logos. Heraclitus had brought this word into the philosophical vocabulary in Ephesus in 500 BC, where he said that there was logos and there was fire. And logos was the plan, and I think fire, in his understanding, was the basic element, but this was the plan in action. So there was a plan in time. Anyway, the turning point in history came when St. John, seeing that St. Paul failed at the Areopagus to address the Greeks in their language, wrote the prologue to his gospel. And he had to use the word logos. He said, in the beginning there was logos. It's translated traditionally as, in the beginning there was the word. But that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you can't understand what's going on here unless you go back to the original Greek word, which is logos. So in the beginning there was logos, and logos was with God, and logos is God. Logos is God. This is a complete change in the way anyone was talking about this up to this point. And at this point, Christianity united the Hebrew tradition and the Greek tradition into a new type of synthesis. And I'm saying, so Jesus Christ is the Logos. He's not, and the Logos is a being. It's a creature. It's not just a plan. It's not just geometry. It's an actual human being that is the implementation or the epitome of this plan of the universe. So the Jews killed Christ. Okay? When they killed Christ, they killed the Logos, or they attempted to kill the Logos. And when you reject the Logos, you're rejecting the order of the universe. And when you reject the order of the universe, which means the social order as well as the physical order, you become a revolutionary. And I'm saying that's what Jews have been ever since this time. And that's the premise of the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
Okay, and here's where I understand that view from a Catholic perspective. After all, if Jesus was the Messiah, then yes, he had logos. And that even historically, I mean, as a Jew, I recognize that Jesus had a logos all over the place. I mean, I don't think there are too many people who have ever walked the earth who had more logos than Jesus. There was a tremendous meaning there. There was a tremendous greater sense of purpose, and there was a tremendous spirituality there. However, I would suggest that the Jewish people also have logos, and that any individual can have logos if they have a meaning to life. I mean, I look to Jewish psychologist Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he developed what's called logotherapy based on logos. Right. He survived Auschwitz, and he came out and said, "This is how I survived. I understood my purpose in the world. I understood, and he was a religious Jew, by the way, who wrapped tefillin every morning. And that the problem with Freud, who he had a falling out with, was that Freud believed in the pleasure principle, that everything in existence was there to make you happy, for pleasure. And then he talked about Adler, who was influenced by Nietzsche, who believed in the principle of will. And that, of course, is the totalitarian principle. Whereas Frankl embraced the concept of logos, which I think is totally in Jewish custom. And that is that the individual has the capability to understand meaning, to understand existence, and to perceive it, and then to order their life in such a way as to pursue it within the context of what's possible.
Yeah, well, you're not just talking about Jews. Every human being is a rational creature. That's the essence of what we are. We are a creature of logos. And the fact that we're talking with each other right now is a sign that we share this logos. We can talk. You can say something. I can understand what you're saying. I can respond. You can understand what I'm saying. Yeah, that's logos. That's right. You're absolutely right. It's not just the Jewish people. It's every single person on the face of the earth was created by God as a rational creature. In this way, human beings are different than animals. Human beings are the only creatures that can talk to each other. Animals bark and they squeal and they do make all kinds of noises, but they don't talk to each other about abstract concepts like speech and logos. So yeah, that's nothing unique to the Jewish people. Nothing whatsoever unique there.
I haven't claimed it is.
Mankind. What is unique to the Jewish people? They were chosen by God. They are God's chosen people. Okay? God singled them out as a special group of people, and he talked to them face to face. Now, almost face to face. And we're talking about someone like Moses. Okay? Moses goes up and there's a burning bush, and it's God speaking to him. I mean, this is something special. God didn't do this to anybody else. He's talking to Moses. Moses is a little bit intimidated. He says, well, tell me who you are. He said, I am who am. This is something that no other group of people on the face of the earth ever heard.
Right.
The Jews are completely unique in this regard because they were given this revelation directly from God. That is completely unique. No one else had that opportunity. Sure. So we have to establish why the Jews are unique, okay? Because they had revelation. The Greeks did not have revelation. The Greeks had to figure this out on their own, okay, without any help from God directly. And so they started talking about, well, maybe what's the earth, what's this whole universe made of? Is it water? That's what Thales said. Is it air? That's what Anaxagoras said. Is it fire? That's what Heraclitus said. And gradually they came to their own understanding that it wasn't anything physical, that this God could not be something physical. And Aristotle finally came to the whole point. He's the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover. Everything depends on him. And so what I'm saying here is that St. John took these two traditions and brought them together in Christianity with the word logos. Okay, that's why we're talking about logos. Now, I said, simply because of the fact that we're human beings, we are talking together and we have a certain level of logos. That's not the upper limit. And what you see over this period of time is people trying to come to a deeper and deeper understanding of the meaning of logos. Aristotle took it to a completely different level. It's nothing physical. It is the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover. Plato said it had to be something above the physical realm, and that's where it stood. And Plato said, well, if we just contemplate essences, we'll rise to that level all by ourselves. Well, it didn't work. And so what you see here at a certain point with both Greeks and Jews is that they said, we're going to do it our way. And Jesus Christ said, no, you got to do it my way. Because Jesus Christ came down. You can't go up. This is what St. Augustine realized. I can't do it. Man, you can't rise to that level. Plato had the right idea, but you can't do it. So there's no point even talking about it anymore because it's obsolete anyway because Jesus Christ came down. And so what you see throughout history is people achieving groups of people nations achieving a certain level of logos and then stopping. It stopped. And I'm saying that the Greeks stopped. There were the Plotinus and Porphyry. They both existed after Jesus Christ came on this earth, and they said, we're going to do it the way Plato said, and St. Augustine said, no, you can't do it. It's obsolete. You're barking up an obsolete tree. And the Jews did the same thing. They said, we're going to do it our way. Annas and Caiaphas said, they stood at the foot of the cross and they said to Jesus Christ, if you come down from the cross, we'll accept you as the Messiah. Okay. In other words, you've got to do it our way. If you don't do it our way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And so they stopped the Jewish religion, the Hebrew religion. Let me talk. The Hebrew religion stopped there. The temple was destroyed. So you don't have that religion anymore. You can't fulfill that religion anymore because you don't have a temple, you don't have a priesthood, and you don't have a sacrifice. And Yochanan ben Zakkai, the rabbi, at this point understood that, and he escaped from Jerusalem under siege at the time of Titus. He went to Titus and said, I'm a friend of Rome. I want you to do me a favor. I want to start a school. And this is the beginning of Judaism as we know it now. This is the synagogue Judaism and not the temple Judaism. It's younger than Christianity. It came after Christianity. And that's the attempt of Jews to try and have a religion without a temple, without a priesthood, without a sacrifice. And that, in my humble opinion, it's the dead end that the Jews landed in. And because they couldn't accept it, they became revolutionaries. And that's what the Jews have been ever since, revolutionaries.
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, Aristotle arrived at the principle of primus mobile, which is God, actually, and that Jews embraced, I would contend, Greek knowledge long before Jesus. I mean, we could go back to Alexander the Great's conquest of Judea.
Philo of Alexandria is a classic.
Philos Alexandrius, exactly. And also
what you're talking about.
Right. And I would also contend that the Talmud, which is not in any way contradictory to the Torah, and which is basically an expostulation of Torah principles in a manner that we can live by them and function and understand them at a deeper level, entirely uses Greek methodology in its approach to issues. And that, in fact, the synagogue Judaism goes back hundreds of years before the destruction of the temple. It goes back to really as far back, they say, as Ezra, who came back from the Babylonian conquest and who built the second temple. But it also, in reality, goes back to Hellenic times when the temple became perverted. It was taken over, and Jesus was absolutely right to go into the temple and start throwing out the criminals and the money lenders and whatnot. It had become secularized. It was taken over by a secular sect of Jews called the Sadducees. The Pharisees then, at that point, and this was in the time of, really right after Judah Maccabee, in the time of Simon and John Hyrcanus, they developed the synagogue system as a counterpoint to the corruption of the temple because they had lost control of the temple. So the synagogue system, there's something, and the synagogue is nothing more than, it's not a temple, nor does it claim to be. It is a place of learning. It is a place of worship, and it is a place by which the Jews can continue worshiping in the same way the Catholics continue worshiping Jesus through the Mass. It's not a contradiction. You know, yes, we don't have the sacrifice, and we pray for the rebuilding of the temple, but the synagogue allows for a means of worship without the sacrifice until we return and redevelop the sacrifice. And it was developed before the destruction of the Second Temple. So I would suggest to you that Rabbinic Judaism, as it's called, Talmudic Judaism, it was around long before Jesus, and it continues to this day. And one of the contradictions I see in your work, which is brilliant and which I admire, is that you point out revolutionary movements in Christianity. And by the way, I consider Judaism to be very conservative and not revolutionary, and that a lot of the revolutionary Jews are heretics as much as Christian revolutionaries. But you point out that, like, for example, the Albigensian heresy and the Hussite movement by John Huss in Bavaria, and more radical elements of the Reform, like Thomas Munster and the Anabaptists and Cromwell, that you refer to them as Judaizing, even though it's scant evidence that Jews actually had anything to do with it. But you say philosophically that they were Judaizing because they were doing a very strict literal interpretation of the Torah. And yet you also claim that Calvinism is Judaizing because you say that it embraced the Talmud. What I would suggest here is that the literal strict interpretation of the Torah is a heresy in Judaism, because you need the Talmud, you need the rabbis who are qualified and who are holy, and you need the responsa in order to understand the Torah. It's not to be taken as a literal word. There was a heresy within Judaism in the 19th century called the Karaite movement, which broke away and insisted that they live literally by the Torah. It was one of the great schisms in Judaism. So, the fact that some Christian groups decided to go to a literal interpretation of the Torah and say, oh, we have a right to conquer people as if they're Canaanites, that's nothing to do with Judaism. That's a heresy in Judaism.
Right. It is. It is. I agree with you. But I'm saying that what happened at this period of time is that the Bible got disconnected from the church. So in a sense, I agree with you that no individual can interpret the Bible properly without some type of ecclesial structure. And right. I can see what you're saying, that the Talmud is an attempt to do this. But I don't agree with you that the Talmud is consistent with the Torah. I don't agree. Okay. I think that the Talmud is a perversion of the Torah. I think that, I don't know where I read this, but I mean, at some point, more than once during the research that I was doing over 10 years ago, I came across the phrase, whatever the Torah forbids, the Talmud permits. And
that's untrue.
I came across it more than once.
It's untrue. And have you studied the Talmud? You should talk to a Talmudic rabbi. I mean, that is simply not the case. It doesn't permit stuff that the Torah, it basically puts things in a context that it can be practiced. Now, you also get into the claim that the Talmud has insulting comments about Jesus.
Right.
First of all, I don't think so. I mean, I've done some research on it. You're talking about a book called Toledot Yeshu, which you also mentioned, which does have insulting analysis of Jesus. It's not Talmud. It's a book. And yes, it's not. I'm not proud of the fact that it was written and that Jews look to it. That's not good. However, the Talmud itself doesn't say anything insulting or anything at all about Jesus. There's one quote in the Talmud that was mentioned by Nicholas Donin when he met with the Pope, which said that Jesus is burning in hell in human excrement. Yeah. That's not a reference to Jesus, from what I understand, and I've consulted with some people about that. That was written by Onkelos. Now, Onkelos was a Roman. He was a pagan, and he was more than just a pagan. He was involved in Roman worship and some kind of occult. And then he converted to Judaism, and he became a very good Jew, a very revered Talmudic contributor to the Talmud. He wrote that in reference to the times when he was involved with all kinds of garbage about, pagan worship. And it was not about Jesus. Now, that's one theory about it. And I would tell you the reason I think that's probably true is because, first of all, the Jewish understanding of hell is not an anthropomorphic place where people burn in hell, in excrement. It's just, we don't view it as something where stuff goes on like that. It's not, that's actually more, frankly, a Christian view of hell. The Jewish view of hell is a little bit fuzzier than that. We don't know what it's like. We know it exists, but it's not, those comments are not consistent with the Jewish understanding of hell. That's more consistent with pagan views at the time. So I honestly don't think that comment had to do with Jesus in the Talmud.
This isn't the first time this has come up. You remember the disputation at Tortosa?
Yes.
the Jews were forced to come in and sit down there as the priest went through the Talmud and pointed out one passage after another, and finally the rabbi had to about Jesus in the Talmud, and finally the rabbi said, "No, it's not that Jesus; it's another Jesus." And
oh, I know.
One of the commentators said this was the beginning of Jewish humor. This is also part of Jewish history here. If you read Heinrich Graetz, the father of Jewish historiography, he has a long, eloquent passage in there where he talks about how the morals of Polish Jews have been corrupted by studying the Talmud, because all the Talmud taught them to do was to cheat and steal.
Now, look, Heinrich Graetz, as much as...
Are you going to dispute Heinrich Graetz?
Yes, I am. He was a good historian and he was an admirable Jew, but he also had an animus toward religious Jews, and particularly in Poland. He was a German Enlightenment, what they call the Haskalah. He was a Haskalah figure who wanted to modernize Judaism. I think he meant well, but he had an animus particularly toward Polish Jewry, which he looked down on as ignorant and whatnot. And he didn't like, he was not comfortable. He was an assimilationist. He was not comfortable with religious people. So you have to view him in that context.
Jew who had been influenced by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, there were refugees. I mentioned Solomon Maimon, his memoir of growing up in Lithuania under the tyranny of the rabbis. He found refuge in Berlin with Moses Mendelssohn. There's a whole tradition of basically what you're talking about. That's true. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But I'm saying over the big picture, what emerges out of this big picture? I'm saying the only continuity that you can find in Jewish history is the Jewish revolutionary spirit. And it's not, it's not part of the religious tradition, although it can be part of this religious tradition. It transcends this tradition. I'm saying it's what unifies this whole 2,000-year period of history.
It's an interesting precept. I disagree with it in that Judaism is a belief in the Almighty God. It's a conservative belief. It's not involved in revolutionary activity, and that the revolutionaries that you're talking about are heretics. That's
What about Simon Bar Kokhba?
Well, that was during the time of Jesus. He came around less than 100 years after Jesus was crucified, and that came around at the tail end of the Messianic movement, which was happening. Jesus was part of that. I mean, it was before and after Jesus, there was a lot of people who were coming around claiming to be Messiah, and I would say that Bar Kokhba was the last one in that area. That was an anomaly in Jewish history. But you're right in that you point out that the Jewish understanding of Messiah is different than the Christian understanding, at least as it stands now. Right. But you're missing a part of it. You're missing the fact that the Jewish understanding of the Messiah is that the Jewish people have to reach a level of spirituality and doing good deeds, so doing mitzvahs and belief in God and a certain level of knowledge and education to set the stage for the coming of the Messiah, who will be a man, and it will have to also accompany the return to Israel, the ingathering of the exiles to that tiny little swath of land that you, by the way, inaccurately historically call Palestine. But I don't want to go there. But it's that, and then there is the beginning of the rebuilding of the temple. Now, historically, and I think that you understand this, Cyrus the Great of Persia was called a Messiah in the book of Ezra because he helped bring the Jewish people back to Israel, back to Judea, which is what it was called back then. And he gave them authority to rebuild the temple. He gave them, actually, the actual edict is in the book of Ezra.
Right.
Now, that is why he's called a Messiah, because he helped further this process. But it's a spiritual process. It is political and even military, maybe, only in the sense that the Jew, going all the way back to Abraham, is obligated to take possession of that tiny little swath of land. Now, I don't claim to understand that. It's a mystery to me. But that's what the Torah says from beginning to end. It's not to conquer the world. It's not to be revolutionary. It's simply to, once they're in that little piece of land, which they are in today, it's the obligation of the Jew to worship God and to be spiritual and to, try to live to the precepts of the moral and ethical code of the Torah, which will then bring about the Messianic age. And by the way, I think Christianity believes in this too, to a certain extent.
Well, was Simon Bar Kokhba the Messiah or not?
He was not he was a false Messiah. And there were several back then.
He was recognized by all of the rabbis at that time as the Messiah.
He was not. He was recognized by some of the rabbis who were fooled and who were brought into this false Messianic movement, just like people was fooled by Shabtai Zvi. And it was
Shabtai Zvi recognized by the rabbis as the Messiah.
By some rabbis, but he was totally rejected by the mainstream rabbis in Judaism, who fought against that and who fought against his Sabbatian legacy tooth and nail. There was a whole civil war in Judaism over that.
That's not my understanding. My understanding is that the overwhelming majority of the rabbis recognized Shabbatai Zvi as
false. No, they did not. I would recommend that you read a book by Rabbi Marvin Antelman called To Eliminate the Opiate. He gets into this and this amazing civil war that took place in Judaism to reject and to stop this movement and its aftermath. And then you had Jacob Frank and these other phonies who came along. They were communists. They were not. Shabtai Zvi proved his messiahship by engaging in perversion at the Bema. He was excommunicated by his own rabbi in Smyrna. They were not recognized by the rabbis. It became a popular movement. It was like a craze. It was like a rock band. He traveled around. He was like the Rolling Stones. It became
a lot of Jews sold their property in Europe.
Yes, they got sucked into it.
Turkey because the Messiah had arrived.
And a lot of Christians followed Thomas Munster. I mean, this was a charismatic movement that was a complete departure from conventional Torah true Judaism. And he even said so himself. He says, I'm going to prove my messiahship by desecrating the Torah and by engaging in orgies and all this other crap that he did. He was, this was not, it was not accepted. I mean, Judaism was at a low ebb at that point, as you point out, because of the Khmelnytsky massacre and there's several other things. The people might have been more vulnerable to it. But for the most part,
it led to widespread disillusionment among the Jews. I mean, it was a catastrophe. The Jewish Encyclopedia says it was the second greatest catastrophe after the destruction of the temple. It wouldn't have been a catastrophe unless a lot of Jews went along with him thinking he was the Messiah.
They did. A lot, by the way, so a lot of non-Jews even believed he was the Messiah. But look, it was still a heretical movement. The rabbis, most of whom rejected it. And I mean, some people got sucked into it. I mean, it's like people got sucked into the mortgage meltdown in 2007. They started to sell all their money and buy these phony mortgages. It was like a mass movement. But it was not conventional Judaism. And, he obviously proved to be a phony. I mean, when the Sultan of Turkey put him on the spot, he sold his soul.
He converted to Islam.
Exactly. Because he was given a choice, either convert to Islam or die.
Right.
But look, the point is that the idea of the Jewish Messiah is not a physical conqueror of the world. He's not going to be coming here to physically, forcibly transform man. That's a communist idea. That was rejected by the rabbis. It's rejected by Judaism. In fact, the entire edifice of Judaism rejects that. It is somebody who is going to come only if the Jewish people peaceably become more spiritual, more observant, more, doing good, more, raise their level of spirituality. And the Torah gives us the keys.
The judge, and that didn't have to do with gay marriage.
What do you mean, who is he to judge? He's the Pope. I want him to judge. I mean, I'm not Catholic. But I looked to the Pope and
disagreed with the Pope when he said that. There are plenty of Catholics who disagreed.
But I can tell you that as a non-Catholic, as a Catholic Gentile, if you will, I look to the Catholic Church for moral authority.
Okay, let me just, as I said, I'm just a dumb goy on the outside looking in, and I'm trying to make sense of this thing. But there are other Jews who were agree with me. Okay, there are a lot of Jews who agree with me. And one of the things that I tried to present in this book was that there was a Catholic position on dealing with the Jews that I think was successful. And that was sicut Judaeus non. Okay, 1,500 years of the church has to deal with the Jews. Oh, what's the principle here? First principle, no one has the right to harm the Jew. Okay, second principle, the Jew has no right to destroy your culture by undermining faith and morals. I think that's a workable solution. But the problem here is that I'm in a situation where when I say something like this, I'm immediately shouted down by all of the official Jewish organizations like the ADL as an anti-Semite.
Well, I don't agree with that. I don't think you're an
Does the ADL speak for Jews?
No, and I don't think you're an anti-Semite. I think you have a traditional anti-Jewish opinion in the same way that I might have an anti-Muslim opinion. Doesn't mean that I'm against, so I understand that.
With you completely if you say that something like the Gospel of St. John is anti-Jewish. It is anti-Jewish. There's a battle going on between the Jews who accepted Jesus Christ and the Jews who rejected Jesus Christ, and that's what that gospel is about. It's about that conflict, and all I'm saying is that conflict continued from there all the way up to the Kavanaugh hearings. It's not going to go away.
No, it's not. And it's not going to be resolved either. And it's not going to be reconciled because you have two very different views on the nature of Jesus and a lot of the things that emanate from that. And I accept that.
The point I'm trying to make here is, let's take this Pittsburgh thing. Let's take what happened in Pittsburgh. Okay? This is a guy who walks in and guns down all of these Jews. Okay, and now they're going to use this to come after me. Okay, they can't stop those guys. There's no way in the world anybody here knows who the next guy is going to pick up a gun and walk into a Walmart or a school or a synagogue or whatever. Okay, and I'm saying this is self-defeating behavior. Okay, or maybe
I agree with you to politicize this. And I think that synagogues, like probably a lot of churches, they need to be a little bit more careful about making sure there are people with arms in there, and security.
All right, you can say that, but I'm saying that what the ADL engages in is self-defeating behavior because they go after. I've spent 10 years saying the first principle is do not harm the Jew. Okay, and they've called me an anti-Semite for 10 years. That's not anti-Semitism. I'm sorry.
Okay. And look, I'm not a big fan of the ADL. I think they've been very much controlled by the left establishment, in the same way that the National Council of Churches is very communistic.
I'm saying, but we have to face up to this fact. It's not just you and me.
Judaism's been compromised by the left, as has a large portion of Christianity. That's the problem, not our faiths, our respective faiths, which we don't agree, but that doesn't matter. The fact is that even Islam, to an extent, has been radicalized by forces that might be emphasizing more radical parts of that faith at the expense of other parts. It's a political problem. It's not, in a sense, much more than a religious problem, certainly with regard to Judaism. Anyways, but we're reaching toward the end of the program, so I kind of want to wrap it up. I hope I can have you back as I continue reading this excellent book. Let me hold it up again. Yes. And I thank you.
I want to say, Chuck, this is what I've been hoping for 10 years. I've been hoping for some type of dialogue on this issue. And I'm grateful for you to give me the opportunity to talk, because logos is the basis of what we are as human beings, and logos is in the first instance speech and dialogue. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you.
All right, as am I, Michael Jones. Listen, Michael, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. We should do it again soon, and I really appreciate your spending the time.